All right, well, why don't we get started here, and we'll do this in, I guess, a little bit of a sequence. I'm Bob Hinkle with Metrus Energy, and Bruce Schlein from Citibank. And starting out, I'll go through a few slides, and then I think Bruce will talk a little bit about the work that Citibank is doing in the energy efficiency, clean energy space in general, focusing in on efficiency as a service, our topic here today. So we'll do that, probably try to get through some of those discussions in, say, 15, 20 minutes, and then open it up to different questions or topics you might have. But maybe just to start out, to give Bruce and I a little bit of an idea of who's in the room and backgrounds and focus areas of everyone, maybe just a quick show of hands of people here that are, I guess, what I would call customers or end users that are representing buildings. Okay. What about contractors, general contractors, energy service companies, folks more on the engineering construction side? And then consultants or building managers? Okay. Other groups I left out? All right. Okay, well anyway, that gives a good little background there. So, okay, so starting out, we wanted to talk about the market for efficiency as a service, and to do that, wanted to look at the evolution for this market, and in many ways in doing so, look at the history or the world of energy efficiency. And if this timeline here starts in the late 70s, and I think if you go more to the early 70s and before then, energy efficiency was really all about conservation, trying to do with less, to not use something, and certainly with a noble intent, probably was a little bit more, had implications of hardship. And then the world started to think more about the efficiency side of conservation, and that you're not doing it just to conserve because you don't have enough of something, but because it's the right thing to do from a business, financial, and an operational side. And that's really where this timeline kicks in the late 70s with the passage of the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA, that had utilities purchasing power from qualified facilities that were third-party owned, smaller generation systems that could generate power at a level that's more efficient than a utility could, or to certain efficiency levels. And then the utilities would have to pay those qualified facilities, or QFs, at a level that was their avoided cost of building new power plants. So that was really starting to value the delivery of efficient energy resources into the market. Then you move into the 80s and you have utility resource acquisition programs, sometimes called standard offers or demand-side management programs, where utilities started to purchase and have groups come in and deliver to them not energy supply, but energy demand reduction, so paying on a per kilowatt hour basis for delivered reductions of consumption, and starting to put that into their planning. And as time went on, and really the energy service company, ESCO, performance contracting industry, grew up out of those early DSM programs. So in the 80s and 90s, you have energy performance contracting, where you have companies that'll go in and do full turnkey construction and then guarantee a portion of the expected energy savings. That started to get financial institutions into the game who didn't understand energy efficiency, but could understand underwriting the balance sheet of a large general contractor. And as you move into the 2000 period, you have utility deregulation that spurs a lot of independent power producers to come into the market, large central-owned power stations, hundreds of $1 million type investment plants that were financed through power purchase agreements. And power purchase agreements have been around for many decades, but that really emergence of IPPs, financing projects through power purchase agreements where someone owns the energy assets, sells the output at a contracted value for a term, brought in that financing mechanism that then quickly worked its way into the renewable energy world. So wind and solar companies started using power purchase agreements, or PPAs, to finance much smaller sized investments. So instead of $300 million power stations, $3 million solar PV installations at industrial sites or at hospitals. And That was a real mind shift in the market, particularly on the customer side, where you have customers starting to think about, well, maybe I want solar power, but I don't want to buy solar panels. So I'd rather just buy the solar electricity. And those third-party ownership groups, companies like SunEdison and Renewable Ventures was actually a company that I worked at that not too far from here at Nellis Air Force Base back in 2007 had the largest solar PV installation in North America at 14 megawatts. So obviously a lot has changed since then. But that type of work then naturally led to what Bruce and I are going to talk a little bit about today, which is selling energy efficiency as a service, where if power can be bought from a generation station or a solar PV system on someone's roof generating an output of a kWh, you can buy a kWh saved through putting in a higher efficiency lighting system or a new HVAC system. And in 2010, you really started to see the market for efficiency service agreements start to emerge and really has had some growth, but in the last year has taken off quite a bit. So that's a little bit of the landscape of where we've gotten to where we are today. And this, somewhat Simon says, looking figure here is a matrix that shows where the current market is for efficiency as a service as we've tried to plot it out. So if you look at the two different axes here, you have comprehensive solutions in the vertical axis and then pay for performance down in the horizontal axis. And if you take those two, you can plot in different types of companies and see where they fit in this landscape of efficiency as a service. So as you move up the vertical axis for comprehensive solutions, you have more integration of technical and financial services. And then as you move left to right on the horizontal axis, you have more pay per unit of output, variable performance. So starting in the lower left, you have really equipment providers, people that might just sell a lighting technology, equipment vendor that just has a single technology. Then as you move up that axis, you might have people that are selling and installing multiple types of technologies, lighting and HVAC. As you keep going up, maybe those companies also provide some ongoing maintenance or monitoring of the equipment once it's installed. That's a more heightened level of service. And then as you get up in the top left, you have companies that will do turnkey construction, installation, maintenance, and monitoring, and have some type of financing package with it where you're probably more of a capital lease type solution, but you provide some funding. Then as you start to work to the right, you have energy service companies that provide a performance guarantee. So in many ways, they're doing everything that's up in the far left, but they are backing at least part of the output with some type of guarantee where they're saying, you know, maybe we expect 1 million kilowatt hours, but we'll guarantee 900,000 and at least provide some type of remedy if there's less than 900,000 kilowatt hours guaranteed or realized. Moving to the lower right, you see more, you know, maybe less comprehensiveness of solutions, but a higher level of variable payments. There's third-party companies that manage utility programs where maybe they'll agree to get paid on a per kilowatt hour basis for achieving energy reductions in a certain market segment for a utility, and that's their basis of payment. You also have software and monitoring type companies that sometimes are getting paid on a per unit of energy saved basis, but maybe even on a per user basis, so a classic software as a service type model. And then in the upper right, which is really, I think, where Bruce and I will focus today, is groups that are doing integrated, comprehensive solution projects, you know, maybe 6 or even a dozen different efficiency upgrades bundled into a project that someone else is owning, so they're third-party owned, all of those upgrades, and you're providing the customer with financial and technical services that include turnkey installation of the project. And how the customer pays is not a fixed payment like a loan or a lease. They're paying on a per kilowatt hour delivered basis. And you see that in the world now, well, certainly of solar projects, solar PV systems, but also energy efficiency. I'm with Metrus Energy, so obviously talking here a little bit about how Metrus views our efficiency services agreement, which is our core focus. And part of it is still in that historical context that I was talking about, where efficiency services agreements might seem new, but they're really based on two very well-proven contracting vehicles in the energy world: power purchase agreements and traditional performance contracting. And the green box to the right shows what the key elements are of an efficiency services agreement. So it takes the third-party ownership, 100% financing aspects of a power purchase agreement. It takes the payment per unit of output element of power purchase agreements, and then couples it with the integrated turnkey solutions and some form, at least of a minimum guarantee from a contractor that's coming out of the world of performance contracting, and is really a hybrid vehicle that gives customers the ability to have third-party ownership of assets that they might not want to own. It integrates the technical and financial solutions that makes it easier for customers, since they don't always have time to take care of their buildings, even though that's where their business is going on. And since someone else is owning the assets, and since the payments are variable, it's something that can be off balance sheet to a customer and viewed as an operating expense and not a capital expense. So it's a lot like they start to get another bill that you could think of as an energy efficiency utility bill. Under these projects, you'll implement something, save a customer some money, and then their energy bill will get lowered, but then they'll also start to receive a bill for the ESA, the Efficiency Services Agreement, but that'll be for the negawatt hours that they're no longer using. But the sum of those two bills will be less than what they're paying before. In terms of the relationship, it's a project finance type structure. We do a fair amount of work with Citibank, so we come in, we fund the project, some with our equity, some with outside debt from groups like Citibank to get to 100% financing. You then have the efficiency service provider enter into the service agreement directly with the customer. It'll call out what type of work's going to be done. It'll detail how savings are measured and verified. It'll talk about the type of work that's going to get done, what type of equipment and where. It'll lay out the cost per unit of energy saved the customer will pay. And then simultaneously, you enter into, or the service provider enters into a contract with an energy service company or general contractor that is paid to design and construct the project, provide some ongoing maintenance and monitoring, and then provide Metrus or the service provider with a performance guarantee for part of the expected savings. So one of the aspects that's different about what a service agreement is compared to a traditional performance contract is under a traditional performance contract, the guarantee is typically only up to, say, 90% of the expected savings. Under an efficiency services agreement, the deal or the transaction is underwritten to 100% of the expected value. So you have a service provider and the contractor taking on performance risk. So it should allow for better priced projects and more savings to be put to work to get bigger projects done. To the right, a little tough to see, but one of the key points of a service agreement is that you're trying to charge the customer at a level that's below what they're typically paying their utility. So here in this diagram, the green line is the utility rate, which looks like it's at about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. And this example has the service agreement rate at about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's some immediate cash flow savings for the customers under these transactions. And then over time, the service agreement rate will escalate, but typically at a flatter rate than what the customer might see for their utility bill. So it should provide an added wedge of savings over time. And just to close out a little bit and then hand it over to Bruce, if you look at some of the lessons of the market for efficiency as a service that we've seen really over the last 8 years, it's that it is possible for customers to start to value energy efficiency as a resource and think of not consuming kilowatts but paying for negawatts. and that in order to truly sell efficiency as a service to customers, you do have to do it in a way that is variable and on a per unit delivered basis. Tie that in with monitoring and measurement so you can accurately define what the energy savings are. And energy efficiency transactions are typically smaller than other types of energy transactions. So one of the ways to get to scale and cost-effective financing is to offer a flexible solution that can integrate a wide range of technologies. It can be open to different types of contractors, and where you can, to bundle different upgrades together. And we can talk about some examples of projects that we're working on that do bundling, both in terms of different measures at a single site, but also bundling different sites from a single customer that even cross different state lines. So we can talk about that. Other key elements are that if customers are only paying for realized savings and you're upgrading equipment for them that might be critical equipment that's getting somewhat towards the end of its useful life, you're mitigating key both financial and operational risk for customers. And with projects that we have now that are in their 7th year of operation, we're seeing lots of customers come back with added upgrades to existing projects, whether it's technology advances like LED lighting, bringing things into more economic shape than they were before, or other technology changes. Once you have a services agreement in place with the customer, it can be an ongoing energy efficiency procurement program. So with that as a little bit of a sketch of the landscape for the market and what we're doing, maybe Bruce, why don't you talk a little bit about your perspective from Citi, and then we can open things up.
I'm actually thinking, if you're okay, Bob, maybe while questions are fresh, we could just take a few about
Sure.
Metrus and the structure. And then
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got the microphone here so everyone can hear the questions. And
Hi, if I understood what you were saying, you have some elements of traditional ESPC mixed in with just generally performance contract attributes. I know on the federal side, the benchmark usually is 25 years with certain various degrees of M&V at certain benchmarks to see, okay, are we really getting what we expected at 5-year, 10-year, et cetera? How is that analogous to what you're doing with this service?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's some similarities, but also key differences. Most of, and I'm speaking from the Metrus perspective here, but I think it holds true for the market. Most of these projects are happening in the private sector. So private, Fortune, let's call it 1,000 types, industrial manufacturing type facilities, some retail logistics companies, and then also more in the private colleges and private hospitals. So a little different than the federal government, and part of the reason I bring that up is, one, to talk about the market areas of focus, but the term at which those customers want to enter into an arrangement is a lot shorter than the federal government. So a lot of the private sector customers don't want to go out beyond 10 years. The range of deals that we have, our shortest project is a 4-year services agreement, and the longest is 15 years. And the ones that we have that are over 10 years are more at the hospitals and higher education type customers. All the private sector, industrials, and other companies in that realm are 10 years or less. So a little bit of a difference there.
Are you still doing M&V with those short durations?
Yes. Yeah, so typically, so that's a little bit about the contract term, but then in terms of how we're measuring and verifying savings is that we are following international protocols for measurement and verification, so doing a mix of, I'm sure lots of folks in the room are familiar with option A and option B type measurement and verification. So there'll be a measurement and verification report done at least on an annual basis. So for some customers, what we'll do is there'll be a detailed investment grade type energy audit done. We will use the estimated savings from that energy audit to base the first year's payments from a customer. And then there'll be measurement and verification reports during the term of the agreement, at least one a year, that'll let us know whether we're too high, too low, or just right. and then there's a true-up process. Some customers want more measurement and verification than others. We at a minimum do annual for everyone. And part of it's just a balancing of where a customer wants us to be spending our effort. Obviously more measurements can add some more costs, although the cost of M&V and ways to do it remotely are getting better and better each year. But that's something that we try to be flexible on, but there is ongoing M&V each year. Sure.
Yeah, could you talk about how you ensure the occupant comfort standards are met as well when you do these energy upgrades?
Sure. So the customer is involved throughout the entire process of the development, and for certain aspects, they will have the ability to do overrides if they need to. So even though we're owning the equipment and you could say controlling it in a certain sense, customers do have the ability to change set points if they need it. We will base the energy savings on certain assumptions that do get fixed with set points that put some bounds around it, and the customer gets to tell us up front where they think those bounds should be. And then if they deviate from that because their operational requirements change or they need it, then we will continue to measure the savings using some of those pre-agreed upon baselines, plus some ongoing measurements. Like for example, if we have a project with a chiller, we will measure the efficiency of the chiller and its kW per ton reading, but we will have some stipulated parameters that the customer agrees to before the contract is ever signed about how it's operated. So that's how we try to strike that balance.
So I'll ask you the million-dollar question. Transfer of assets. So let's say you do a project, it's 7 years. How do those assets transferred? I'm sure they're going to go back to the owner or the person that started the contract. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's an important part of things. So let's say we have a service agreement that is 7 years, and we make it to the end of 7 years. There's 3 options that the customer has. Option 1 is to agree with Metrus to renew the arrangement for a to-be-determined time period and at a to-be-determined price. So, maybe we extend for another 2 years, and instead of charging them 8 cents a kilowatt hour saved, we'll charge them 4. Something like that. The parties just agree to keep it going. The other option that they have is to purchase the assets at an estimated fair market value. So Metrus still owns the assets at the end of the term, so they can purchase them, and it's not for $1 like a lease type of transfer, but it's also going to reflect that energy efficiency assets don't, have a robust secondary market, but there will be more of an appraisal done, and we give customers an idea of where that might come out. On a lot of projects, it's probably in the mid to high single digits of the original project cost, depending on the type of assets, because sometimes we have chillers that have a 25-year life at least, or, and sometimes it's LED lights, which, are going to be 10 or less. So that's option 2. Option 3 is that the customer could say, Metrus, we're done, come and remove what you think you can remove, and, we'll part ways. And what we typically expect is that it'll be one of the first 2 options, just because A, the fair market value price isn't that big and there's some disruptive elements to it. But that's, contractually, that's what we do.
But from a financial standpoint, does the client customer have to carry that liability on their books? So if they're forecasting out, thinking of American business and how it is,
Yeah.
7 years from now, that's a liability they have to come up with. And I know there are laws against calculating the exact value of that.
Sure.
At the start of the contract, but that seems to be one reason why some companies don't do it. May not be a valid reason.
Yeah.
But it's the worry of, okay, where's my business going to be in 7 years, and I have to come up with that.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing, the way we structure from an accounting standpoint, even with this potential fair market value buyout, it's an option. So it doesn't have to be on the books of the customer, but you're right, from an operational perspective, you have to be dealing with the customer that, from, I guess, just a pure business operational standpoint, can say, okay, in year 7, I might need to come up with some money. And we do talk with customers about this, and where most get comfortable is a lot of the people we're dealing with expect to be in these buildings for a while. So even though 7 years, a lot can change, they're not thinking about leaving per se, although they know it could happen. And then they do have some optionality. If they decide that they don't want to come up with the money at that point, we can continue to go on with them, and we're still saving them money, and so they don't have to come up with a purchase price there. The other thing that gets people comfortable is, even though they don't know the exact price, they can get a somewhat of an educated idea of it, and then they'll look at the cash flow and say, okay, maybe I need to come up with $100,000 at the end of year 7, but if I do, I'm going to be picking up $250,000 of energy savings in that same year, so there's some comfort there.
Have you done any projects that aren't asset-based, so like a retrocommissioning where you've got low cost, no cost type of measures? Doing anything like that?
So we haven't done a project that is just retrocommissioning, although some people have approached us and talked to us about it. Some of the measures within our projects fit that category. So doing an upgrade for an industrial group, and you have 12 different efficiency measures, and included in it is a retrocommissioning measure, and then we're also paying a contractor each year to go out and make sure that those tweaks that were done to systems are still there, and the customer is crediting us with certain amounts of savings. We've done that, but not just on a standalone basis without any other assets. But on a lot of fronts, there's nothing to prevent that, what you're talking about.
Do you leverage utility incentives or grants or other financial vehicles to push these projects, or is that on the customer's onus?
Typically, we're taking the utility incentives, and it'll be transparent. I mean, often, well, it has to be lots of times because it has to go through the utility to the customer. But we've done a couple different things. On most projects, we get the utility incentive in the sense that, let's say there's a $150,000 incentive. It'll go to the customer, and the customer will agree to flow it to Metrus as part of the project. And because we're getting that incentive, we can charge them, making up numbers, 7 cents per kilowatt hour instead of 7.5 cents. So typically we'll get that. There are some times that the customer elects to keep that incentive themselves, and we just make sure that they know that that's part of the benefit of the project. But in all instances, we do try to leverage incentives everywhere we can.
So why don't I
Yeah, why don't you
jump
take
in,
it over?
and we'll have.
It depends on the type of project. I would say most of our projects are somewhere between 4 and 8 year simple paybacks. We've done some lighting-only deals that, of course, have a lot shorter payback, but if you're talking about integrated measures, that's about right.
So I'm going to take maybe 10 minutes of remarks, so there'll be plenty of time for more discussion. First thing I wanted to mention was, I think the title of this session was derived from an article that Bob and I wrote, and it leads off with Citi, and it really shouldn't. We were a latecomer to this space and a latecomer to the activity that we've done with Bob, so I just want to point out that, that there are others who've really led the way on this. My experience was my first job at Citi. I was leading the sustainability team. We were tasking our operations groups with, carbon reduction and efficiency targets. They had chased those for a decade or more, found that they had harvested most of what Citi was willing to self-finance, and most corporates like Citi typically will self-finance somewhere between 2 to 3 year simple paybacks. And so we found ourselves in a place where we had these targets that we were, growing for our operations colleagues. We had self-finance thresholds that were not changing, and we had a list of projects that were going unfunded. And so this served as a catalyst for us to go look for an alternative. And we ended up pursuing an ESA on a project, on a data center that we have in London. and we decided we would use ourselves as a guinea pig. So we actually ended up being both the property owner and the lender into a structure like this. It was one of the funnier credit committee calls I was on, where we were evaluating how we felt about the risk of, taking city credit. It passed. We went ahead with it. But what was really remarkable about that experience, a few things which has really informed what we're doing today with Bob, and that is that our dynamic is a dynamic that we see in lots of other companies, which is a dynamic where there are targets that are not being self-financed, where teams are harvesting the low-hanging fruit, or what the corporate's willing to self-finance, and they need an alternative. And the typical dynamic is that the operations teams will bump up against this hurdle. They will go back to their treasury folks, who will deny them. They'll come back to the sustainability teams and say, what are we supposed to do? We think about pursuing third-party alternatives. The third-party alternative makes its way back to Treasury, and Treasury says, why aren't we self-financing this? Why are we going to pay, our cheapest capital is to self-finance. Why don't we just self-finance this? And the operations people are like, remember us? We were here a few months ago asking you to self-finance this, and you said no. And so, we see that cycle, and that's kind of a socialization cycle where Treasury, who in many companies, efficiency is not top of list for them. It's not something they're familiar with. They're, have other things that rise to the fore. And this sort of process of, helping them understand what the dynamic is, what the need is, the value of this approach in terms of all the things that Bob, laid out in his presentation, that's what led us to the outcome that we had. And that's what has led us to think that this is a really powerful solution for many of the corporate clients that we serve. And with Bob and team, we'll go into some examples of work that we're doing together, but are seeing this as a very, very appealing way for corporates to continue on their trajectories of being more efficient and reducing their carbon footprints. There are a bunch of things that I think we can talk about here today. I think for us, some of the hurdles that we've had to face that Bob has alluded to, one of them is scale. We are constantly trying to think of ways that we can identify ways to aggregate pools of properties, franchises, university systems, hospital systems. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we're brainstorming about. We can share some of those ideas, and are making a lot of headway and a lot of progress. I think some of the other nuances that we can touch on here today that we're overcoming together, we are working on properties where there's a lessee involved, so the host, what we refer to as the host, doesn't own the property, so we're having to get landlord consent to have somebody else owning a piece of their property for a period of time. We are thinking about how we can, as I just alluded to a moment ago, work with entities who, again, may not own their properties, but may have a property management relationship with them. They may be franchisees. They could be supply chains. And how do we think about, touching properties that, may be harder to touch because of the, the credit profile or the credit quality. For Citi, at least out of the gate for us, this is a relatively new product. We started out just looking at investment grade hosts. And as we get more comfortable with the product and the performance of the product, I could see that box, changing a little bit. I think, why don't I pause there? And there's more that we can talk about if there aren't questions, but why don't we see if there's some questions for discussion? We can talk about, why don't we talk about, can talk about a specific deal? Might be a good.
Yeah, sure. So we're speaking a little bit about aggregation, and one customer that we're working on with Citi is a Fortune 100 industrial technology company, has lots of sites across the country and across the world. And they had a lot of work at their facilities that started to just stack up that, as Bruce was saying, just wasn't getting funded. Projects that had a decent payback period, but they would rather put their money back into something that's in their main line of business and generate a higher return on those type of using their own internal dollars. So they approached us about an efficiency services agreement. And one of the tricks is they really needed portfolio-wide upgrades. So they have sites that are in high energy power, high energy cost regions, California or the Mid-Atlantic, much higher cost per kWh regions, but they also have a lot of sites in parts of the country where you might only pay 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And so the economics of those projects had some very different parameters, even though it was the same technology, same use pattern of the site. And the other constraint is that they didn't want to enter into agreements that were beyond certain terms of the leases for the sites where they were located. So it put a short window on things. So if you want to do a project, let's say in the Midwest, that has a 8.5, 10-year payback, how do you fit that into a 5-year term? And that's where service agreements can be pretty powerful, because those types of projects do work if you bundle that with sites that are in other parts of the country that have much higher energy rates, where the same project has a payback period of 2 years. And so with this customer and Citi, we've been able to package together and bundle different sites that are sometimes thousands of miles apart into a single transaction that we close and charge the customer an agreed upon per unit of energy savings for those sites. And I think now we're up over $40 million worth of work for this one customer, and that's one example of how we're bundling and getting to scale, and a couple different issues we've tackled there. But so that's certainly one example of a transaction. It should, and we hope. We always like to see those type of regional pushes, and energy. In many ways, the last few years have been tough for the world of energy efficiency, just because energy prices have been historically reasonably low. So, not that that's bad for customers, but it does make energy efficiency projects tougher, and I think prices are starting to work their way back up a little bit, but. Definitely, you see different cities. I know Bruce, New York, and other cities have their own ordinances, and I do think that starts to put optics on things for building owners, and hopefully pushes them in the right direction.
Did you try to quantify for customers what the maintenance savings would be for lighting upgrades?
We do. So. That often is part of it, particularly with something like LED lighting, where there's longer life of assets and there can be some avoided maintenance costs. And sometimes customers will pay for those. Other times they just might recognize them as benefits to the project. And if anyone has a better term for, we try to think, we call that non-energy savings, and it's like, it's true, but it's not a great name.
And Bob, I think we're both agnostic on the resource that's saved, right? I mean,
Right.
There could be water. We've looked at projects together, I think, where there was a waste output from a food manufacturing cycle where the customer was paying tipping and carting and waste landfill fees that could be avoided in like a biodigester that's generating energy plus saving those
Yeah.
costs.
Yeah, and in many ways, this is a cost avoidance mechanism. We've, on the water side, we've done projects with water savings, and it can also be avoided costs if someone gets charged for sewer charges or other things. If you can save water and runoff in different ways, there's those types of benefits as well. Sure.
And your LED lighting, do you specify brand to the customer, or work with the customer on what brand you're going to use?
We let the customer decide with the contractor. Both need to be comfortable with it. We want definitely well-proven technologies that have a good warranty, so we'll weigh in there. But in terms of, having a preference of one brand versus another, no.
So just real quick, it's kind of a risky, implementing energy efficiency projects isn't easy. And so there's some risk involved, and I'm kind of wondering if you've had any projects that didn't go as you projected, and then just kind of explain who bears the brunt of that. I imagine it doesn't fall on Citi. I imagine it falls somewhere in that Metrus ESCO kind of connection, but I'd like to kind of understand that.
Yeah, no, it is. It can be messy. There's different problems that happen. We're dealing with a hospital project right now where some of the local compliance folks from the healthcare industry have come in and identified a couple areas where some added changes needed to be made to the scope. And some of those might fall to the customer because they represented certain things as compliant, and others might fall to the ESCO or the contractor that's implementing it. There's other times where sometimes just because these projects can take a while, let's say you're working with a customer and it might take you a year to get a project developed and you're ready to go and you sign the deal, and then the contractor shows up at the site and they recognize that in building 6, some of the lighting scope has already been done. Things like that. And then you need to sort a little bit of that out. So there are issues like that, and part of that we deal with change orders and contracts. Our contracts are all about risk allocation. So part of that there is some risk to Metrus there for sure, but a lot of it will, since the customer is the one who knows their facility and the contractor is the one that specified the design, a lot of what our contracts do is parse those situations appropriately so that everyone is taking on the risks that they should. But yeah, there's definitely, it's not all seamless. They could be, yeah. If they totally miss the mark on something like that, without a doubt. Yeah.
And I'll just add, for that reason, when we evaluate these, we call them a two-factor credit, where we're looking at the credit of both. We're more concerned about the credit of the host, but if the ESCO doesn't deliver, the host isn't obligated to pay, and so we're interested in who the ESCO is. We'll typically hire an independent engineer to represent us to evaluate the measures and the projections and give another opinion on it.
Yep.
Bruce, you just read my mind. I was about to ask a question about at what point do you bring in a consulting engineer? Do you do it directly, or do you do a kind of a third party outside to evaluate your recommendations just as part of a due diligence?
Yes. So we do. We use third parties. And we certainly do that on the ESCO side of things, and Bob and I are trying to think creatively about in instances where It's difficult for us to evaluate the credit of the host. We're trying to think, as I mentioned earlier, about instances where there's a parent or some creditworthy entity who has better line of sight than we do into the credit quality, or really the ability of a property owner to pay the equivalent or less than of its utility bill for the life of our contract. So I'm just making up something here. Imagine a franchise like McDonald's who, better than the parent McDonald's, knows the performance of a franchise. Like, they're gonna have way better insight into that than we are. So could one contemplate, and this is really an ask of McDonald's, right? Could McDonald's contemplate providing a guarantee when it looks across its, I don't know how many franchises there are across the country? Could it say, you know, we'll pick the top 20% of our franchisees who we have, you know, 99% confidence that they're going to be there for the life of Bob's ESA contract, and we'll guarantee that payment, and we'll charge them a fee for that. And that would, as I said earlier, that would let us touch properties that we otherwise wouldn't touch. So it's sort of like a third party, like kind of like on the engineering side, but now we're looking to somebody else to have a point of view on the host side.
There's a question back there.
So if you had just dumb it down a little bit, if there was a lighting retrofit energy conservation measure that you were going to perform for the client, how does the financial part, I mean, how do you figure out what the client's going to pay? I'm not familiar with how this type of work gets generated. So, I mean, I'm trying to get a handle on how you develop your fees to the client. And let's just say it's a simple lighting retrofit, not get real complicated about things.
Yeah. So what we'll do is there will be a contractor, you know, an ESCO that'll go out to a customer site, look at a lighting upgrade, you know, possibility for the customer. They'll come up with what the total cost of that upgrade would be, and as part of that, they might not have a final specification of the equipment, but they'll have a pretty good idea. And they'll say, okay, this customer has $1 million worth of lighting upgrades that they can make. And right now, the system of their current efficiency based on, you know, wattage measurements is X. And if you install a new system, it'll have an efficiency gain to Y. And they'll look at the customer's hours of operation and determine that profile. And really in that, assuming a constant use profile and looking at the before and after of the old system's efficiency and the new system's efficiency based on taking a wattage measurement, they'll have an idea of the savings. And so we'll get an idea of what the kilowatt hours saved could be from that lighting measure. And that's what we'll use as the basis for arranging and coming up with our financing. So we'll say, okay, Metrus will come forward and pay for part of the $1 million. Citibank will pay for some of it. That'll get to 100% financing. And then if this project performs according to what the engineering studies are saying, there's going to be a certain number of kilowatt hours each year that are saved. And we'll set the cost per kilowatt hour saved in each year of the contract. So if the project performs according to the engineering report, we'll have, you know, an exact knowledge of what the revenue will be. And then you don't ever know for sure. So that's where we often get a guarantee from who installed the project, maybe not for the expected level of savings, but a decent part of it. And the lender will look to that guarantee as kind of in some ways a worst case scenario. And Metrus will look to the best case scenario of the project performing at 100%, and that's kind of how we tackle projects.
And Bob, that'll determine the term.
That'll determine the term as well.
Right, so, you know, there's this much savings, here's the cost. It's going to take 5 years of savings or 6 years of savings to, you know, to amortize, to pay off the cost of the equipment and the financing.
Yep.
Multiple bid environment.
They work outside of,
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of times they won't get multiple bids and do a low bid or something like that to competitively bid equipment, say like a chiller retrofit or something
Yeah.
like that. Do you find that your customers that are signing these agreements are sophisticated enough to kind of understand that, or are you dealing with that in any way to drive the costs down and make sure it's competitively bid and you have competitive costs for capital equipment?
Yeah. I often with the customers that we're dealing with, there can be a mix, but a lot of them do get pretty focused on that, especially the Fortune 500 type customers they'll get that the ESCOs are going to be procuring equipment. They'll know that there's going to be certain amounts of margin put on it, and they'll somewhat cap what those groups will do, or at least try to get some comfort. And also under our arrangements, since a lot of it becomes pretty transparent, in order to be cost competitive, a lot of the ESCOs and contractors understand that in this model, say compared to maybe some of the other projects they've historically done, there's more transparency and they're more willing to bring down some of their costs as well. So, in other instances, maybe there's not as much pressure. You might have a customer that just loves, a certain ESCO or contractor, and they don't sweat that too much. But more and more, there's increased pressure and downward pricing tendencies.
I got about 5 minutes left, so a few more questions.
I think there's a question back there too, but
Was it
yeah.
back? Okay, here and
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, so typically all of our projects will go through a two-stage energy analysis where, and we sometimes will maybe just start out by saying a little bit about how we get projects. Sometimes we'll get a project from a customer where we talk to the customer. Other times projects will come to us from a contractor, and sometimes they've already done the detailed audit. It's already been done. And sometimes it's more at the earlier stage preliminary assessment. But we will rely on the ESCO or the contractor to do a preliminary and a detailed audit. As Bruce was saying, sometimes there's a third-party engineer that'll come in and sanity check their results. But they're typically doing that, and it's usually at the risk of the contractor, where often in this industry, a preliminary assessment will be for free. That's kind of in some ways, for better or for worse, a little bit of the price of admission. And you do that for free, but you use that preliminary assessment to see if there's a project and what the size and shape of the project is. And then typically what we'll do is we will put forward a letter of intent to the customer that says that, okay, we've done a preliminary analysis that says that you can do a chiller and a lighting project. It'll work in 10 years and you can save 5% on your utility bill. If we come back to you after doing a whole lot of engineering work, you'll do one of two things. You'll either do the project, assuming we're still within that box that you're saying now looks good, or you'll pay a breakup fee that'll cover the cost of the audit. So that's a little bit of how that works. So in some ways you could say that's part of our service, but it's really being done by the contractor. And once you get to the point where people are spending months and months on site and a lot of engineering work, we put some bounds around the risk there, where we're taking risk of delivering a project that we say we can to the customer after the preliminary assessment, but we can't leave ourselves totally open to a customer just, on all of a sudden deciding they don't want to do something.
Are the ESCOs doing this? Are they the same ones that are typically doing ESPCs, or are there some that specialize in this?
Yeah, there's some that are, the ones that I think are seeing more opportunity in the private sector, we're working with more. And then there's some of, if you think of 12 or 16 big ESCOs, we're probably actively working with about 6 of them. and the rest are more still focused in the federal and municipal world.
Have you ever had to deal with a situation where the baseline that you used to do the analysis changed? Where, say, the occupancy of a building went from 8 hours a day to 12, and now you have a different base, so it showed the energy use went up, when actually you may still be saving energy. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so how we handle that on most of our projects is those baselines will be listed and stipulated in the contract, and the customer is agreeing that even if those situations happen, whether it's for the up or the down, those items will always measure as if that baseline is in place. We'll continue to measure the efficiency of the equipment, which goes up and down, but items like that, which inevitably go up and down, the customer agrees to fix. Our guarantee is that the customer only pays for the realized savings according to the measurement and verification. So we don't go to a customer and say, you're going to save 2 million kilowatt hours. We go to a customer and say, this project should save you 2 million kilowatt hours, and we guarantee you that we're going to measure kilowatt hours in a way that you're comfortable with, and that you're going to know the price per kilowatt hour in every year. With a what? Yeah. The owner and the contractor that we have doing the project does that. So, you know, Metrus and Citi, we're in the financing and owning side of this, and we want to work with partners we know that can do that work and integrate well with the customer, any A&E firms and others. Yes. Yep. And then we pay for that. So we have a general contractor, we pay them. Metrus and Citibank's funding will go to pay for that construction and ongoing services, and then we rely on a general contractor to arrange all those other subcontractors. They do. They do. It depends on the project, but a lot of our projects we're charging, 10% below a customer's current utility rate. Others are closer to budget neutral, but in all instances, we're doing it so the customer should be set up for being cash flow positive. They do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but even during the initial agreement, there should be some savings to the customer.
And Bob, useful life is typically longer than the contract
Yes.
of equipment.
Yep.
Yeah.